My parents coldly kicked me out of our home after I said I wouldn't pursue a military career. Until one day I rolled up in a Porsche in front of their house and they simply... I will never forget the look in my father's eyes that April afternoon. A look that carried more than disappointment. It carried a sentence. If you don't follow the military path, you have no place in this family. His words came out with the same precision with which he used to fire at the training range. Direct. Unyielding. Fatal. I was only 17 when my family decided I was no longer worthy of being part of it. Robert and Helen Johnson, third-generation decorated military officers, could not conceive of a son who preferred spreadsheets and market strategies over ranks and hierarchies. Dishonor was the word my father used. The same word engraved on the Medal of Honor displayed in our living room, now attributed to me, as an invisible mark I would carry forever. My mother, always in the shadow of his decisions, merely averted her gaze as I grabbed what I could carry in a worn-out backpack. "You have 1 hour to leave," my father said, checking his military watch, as if my expulsion were just another timed operation in his life of precision and discipline. That night, sleeping on a park bench while a light rain began to fall, I realized that for some, family is just an extension of unquestionable values, not a safe haven of unconditional acceptance. Huddled under my thin jacket, I felt the cold seeping into my bones, but nothing was as chilling as the certainty of abandonment. I left home with $300, a change of clothes, and dry tears on my face. At that moment, I did not know that this would be the first page of a story, very different from the one my family had scripted for me since birth. While my siblings and cousins followed the predetermined military path, receiving support, scholarships, and a well-established network, I was alone, empty-handed, and with a heavy heart. "You're going to die in misery," said my uncle, Colonel Stevens, during the last family lunch I attended. "People like you, without military discipline, won't get far in this world." Everyone laughed and nodded in agreement, while I swallowed dryly along with the overcooked rice and the bitter words. The first few months were the hardest. I landed a job as a waiter in a low-tier restaurant, where the smell of fried food clung to my only dress shirt. I slept on an old mattress on the floor of a room shared with 3 other young men, in a neighborhood where police sirens were more frequent than the garbage truck. "For someone raised in the comfort of a military household, you sure seem to be adapting well to a life of poverty," commented Sergio, one of my roommates, as he watched me count coins for the next day's lunch. I managed a humorless smile. If he only knew that that comfort came at the price of my individuality, he might not think I had lost so much after all. On nights when sleep eluded me, amid the noise of arguing neighbors and relentless thoughts, I began to craft a plan. If my family believed I would fail without military discipline, I would prove I could forge my own discipline, one tempered in the fire of necessity and hardened with the determination of someone who knew abandonment. I saved every penny I could. I cut back on meals, walked long distances to save on transportation, and on my days off, I studied at public libraries. I discovered an ease with numbers and a natural knack for business, talents my father had deemed inferior to military values. After 6 months as a waiter, I secured a job as an administrative assistant at a small tech company. The pay was better, and more importantly, I had access to a computer during lunch breaks. I took every available minute to learn about investments, digital marketing, and app development. "You have potential," my boss said, after catching me studying during a coffee break. "But you need focus." That made me smile inwardly. If there was one thing my military upbringing taught me, it was focus. I had merely redirected that skill to something that truly interested me. Within a year, I developed a simple app that helped small restaurants manage their inventory and reduce waste. Ironic that the idea came from my experience as a waiter, the very job my family would have considered a disgrace for someone bearing our family name. The app started small, but soon attracted investors' attention. Every business meeting felt like entering a battlefield. Only this time, I chose my own strategies. Every victory, every signed contract, was a silent proof that I was right to follow my own path. This company was founded with $300 and a worn-out backpack, I used to say in interviews, without mentioning the part about being kicked out of home. Some stories are too personal to share, even when you become a successful entrepreneur. By the age of 25, I owned a company valued in the Millions. My app had evolved into a full-scale business management platform, used by companies nationwide. I lived in a stylish apartment in the best neighborhood of the city, drove a car that no longer had to be parked on sketchy streets, and, most importantly, enjoyed a financial and emotional freedom that many of my military relatives, bound by hierarchy and fixed salaries, would never know. It was at that moment that my phone rang from an unknown number. "Son?" The hesitant voice of my mother came through the line, as if testing the waters. "We heard about your success. We're proud." I gripped the phone so hard my fingers went white. 8 years of absolute silence, and now, suddenly, pride? I took a deep breath, holding back the avalanche of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. "Thank you for reaching out, Mom," I replied, with a calm I did not feel. "But I'm in the middle of an important meeting right now. Can I call you back later?" I hung up without waiting for a response. That important meeting was with myself, sitting in my office overlooking the city, trying to process the meaning of that call. It was no coincidence it happened 1 week after my photo graced the cover of a business magazine headlined, "The Young Millionaire Who Revolutionized Business Management." A week later, I received a formal email from my father, typical of him, direct and devoid of emotion, as if he were drafting a military report. "We would like to invite you to a family dinner this coming Sunday. Your presence is requested." No mention of years of absence, no apology, just a summons, as if I were still a cadet under his orders. I replied with the same formality. "Thank you for the invitation, but I have important commitments. I suggest we reschedule for next month, after I return from a business trip." The trip was fictitious. My schedule was surprisingly free that weekend, but I felt the need to establish that I now set my own terms. When I finally agreed to meet them, I chose a neutral restaurant rather than the family home where I grew up. I deliberately arrived 10 minutes late, a small act of defiance against the military punctuality imposed on me since childhood. My parents seemed smaller than I remembered. My father, once an imposing figure in his uniform, now looked merely like a middle-aged man with a rigid posture and graying hair. My mother, always elegant but reserved, had new lines of expression that spoke of hard years. "You look good," my father remarked, as if inspecting a subordinate. "Success suits you." "Success didn't fall into my lap, Dad," I replied, with a polite yet distant smile. "I built it brick by brick without anyone's help." Tension hung over the table like a heavy cloud. We talked about superficial things, the weather, recent news, the food at the restaurant. We carefully avoided the elephant in the room, the 8 years of silence, the expulsion, the abandonment. It was my mother who finally broached the subject, once the waiter served the coffee. "We missed you, son. The house felt empty without you." I took a sip of the bitter coffee before replying. "The house wasn't empty, Mom. You emptied it when you decided my dreams didn't fit in." My father cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "We did what we thought was right at the time. We wanted you to have the discipline necessary to face the world. And I have that discipline, Dad. I just applied it in a different arena than the battlefield." "We see that now," he admitted, with what seemed like a trace of pride. "You proved your worth." That phrase hit me like a punch. Worth. As if my existence only mattered now that I had financial success. As if I had to prove something. To be worthy of a family that should love me unconditionally. "I didn't prove my worth, Dad," I replied calmly. "I simply followed my own path. My worth was always there, even when you couldn't see it." The rest of the dinner passed in polite tension. I promised to visit eventually, knowing deep down that I would likely not keep that promise often. When we said our goodbyes in the parking lot, my father extended his hand for a formal shake, while my mother briefly hugged me, leaving a damp mark on my shoulder from a held-back tear. In the following months, our relationship remained superficial and distant. Occasional phone calls, birthday messages, invitations to dinners that I frequently declined due to work commitments. The truth was, I preferred spending my free time with the people who had become my true family, friends who welcomed me when I had nothing, colleagues who believed in my ideas, employees who had grown with me from the start. Meanwhile, my parents made sure to mention my name in their social circles. Our son, the successful entrepreneur, an old family friend casually mentioned when I ran into him by chance. They speak of you as if you had supported every step of your journey. I laughed without humor. Memory is selective, isn't it? At 30, I received an unexpected call from my older brother, Captain Daniel Johnson, decorated for bravery and steadfastly following in Dad's footsteps. We hadn't spoken since I left home. "Dad's in the hospital," he said, his voice tense. "He had a stroke. The doctors say it's serious." I canceled all my meetings for the day and rushed to the hospital. There I found my mother in the corridor, looking smaller and more fragile than ever. She embraced me with a surprising strength. For her slight frame, "He asked for you," she whispered, before he lost consciousness. I entered the hospital room where my father was hooked up to machines monitoring every beat of his disciplined heart. His skin, once bronzed from hours of training in the sun, now had a grayish tone. I sat by his bed, and for the first time in many years, took his hand. "I'm here, Dad," I said softly, unsure if he could hear me. I spent the next few days shuttling between the hospital and work video calls conducted in the corridor. My mother and brother seemed surprised by my constant presence, as if they expected me to reciprocate the abandonment with further distance. One afternoon, while having coffee in the hospital cafeteria, my brother finally addressed the elephant between us. "Why did you come back, after everything that happened?" I looked at the cheap coffee in a plastic cup, so different from the gourmet brew I used to have in my office. "Because some things are more important than the past, Daniel. Family is complicated, but it's still family. He's truly sorry, you know," my brother said, averting his gaze. He never admitted it to anyone, but I once heard him tell Mom one night that he'd made a mistake with you. I nodded, my voice failing me. It wasn't an apology. I never expected one directly from Dad, but it was as close as it would ever get. A week later, my father woke up. His first days were marked by confusion and difficulty speaking, but gradually he regained clarity. When I entered his room after being called by an excited nurse, he looked at me with a clear recognition in his eyes. "Son," he said in a husky voice from disuse. Just that. A single word carrying 8 years of distance. "Dad," I replied, sitting by his bed. "How are you feeling?" He made a vague gesture with the hand not attached to the IV, like a soldier after a lost battle. "This battle isn't lost," I said. "You're still here." He nodded slightly, then said something I never expected to hear. "You were right." I frowned, not understanding. "Right about what?" "About following your own path," he replied laboriously. "I saw what you built. It's impressive." A lump formed in my throat that I tried to hide with a cough. "Thank you, Dad." "No," he insisted, making a visible effort to articulate his words. "I should thank you for coming back, even after everything we did. It wasn't a full apology. Dad would never be capable of that, but it was an acknowledgement. It was a beginning. During his recovery, I grew closer to my family. It wasn't the warm reconciliation I might have secretly wished for in my teenage years, but it was respectful and gradually genuine. I hired the best rehabilitation specialists for my father. When he was discharged, I insisted on paying for a full-time nurse and the necessary medical equipment for our home. My mother tried to refuse, insisting they could manage the expenses, but I was firm. "Let me take care of this," I said to her. "Not out of obligation, but because I can, and I want to help." On one particularly difficult afternoon, when Dad had a relapse and needed a brief return to the hospital, my mother broke down in tears in the corridor. "We don't deserve your help," she sobbed. "Not after what we did." I embraced her, feeling her fragile body tremble with years of pent-up grief. "I'm not doing this to keep score or to show superiority, Mom. I'm doing it because I learned that life is too short to hold on to grudges." She stepped back and looked me in the eyes. "Where did you learn to be like this?" "It wasn't from us. Maybe I learned precisely because of what I went through," I replied honestly. "When you experience the worst, you learn to value the best." Over the ensuing months, we established a new family dynamic. It wasn't the warm relationship I might have secretly longed for in my adolescence, but it was respectful and gradually genuine. My father never mentioned the military, career again, and I never spoke of the hard years following my departure. It was as if we had an unspoken agreement. We would look forward, not back. One Sunday, nearly 2 years after his stroke, while we were having lunch at my parents' home, my father asked to show me something, with steps still hesitant from lingering effects. He led me to his office, a former military sanctuary filled with medals, photos in uniform, and books on strategy. To my surprise, where there had once been a photo of him receiving a decoration, now hung the cover of a magazine featuring my photo and the headline about my business success. "I put it up on the day you left," he said, with slight embarrassment. It was always here. I felt a warmth in my chest I couldn't quite name. Not exactly forgiveness or complete reconciliation, but something close to acceptance. "Thank you, Dad," I replied simply. He nodded, in his customary military manner of showing emotion without really expressing it. "You built something respectable. Different from what I imagined for you, but respectable." I smiled, recognizing that this was probably the highest compliment he could offer. Different paths can lead to worthy destinations, can't they? He agreed, and for a moment, it seemed that the walls of that house, once suffocating with rigid expectations, could finally embrace different definitions of worth. Today, at 35, I look back on the journey I've traveled with a clarity only time can bring. Being kicked out, which at the time felt like the end of the world, was actually the beginning of my true journey. The pain of abandonment forged in me a resilience no military training could have ever instilled. My company continues to grow, now with branches in 3 countries. Recently, I launched a foundation to help underprivileged youth develop professional skills and follow their own paths, especially those who, like me, never fit into the plans others laid out for them. Maintain a cordial relationship with my parents, visiting them monthly and ensuring they have everything they need. My father, now physically more fragile but still militaristic in demeanor, occasionally asks about business matters, trying to connect through the only territory he understands: success. On one of those visits, I encountered my nephew, my older brother Daniel's son, hiding in the garden, silently crying. He was only 12, already bearing the weight of being the 4th generation of military tradition in our family. "I don't want to go to military school, Uncle," he confessed, quickly wiping away his tears, fearful of showing what Dad would call weakness. "I want to be a scientist. I want to study the stars." I looked at that younger version of myself, carrying the same burden that nearly crushed me, and made a decision. I took him back inside, straight to the living room where the family was gathered. "Eli has something to say," I announced, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. I felt him tremble, but I squeezed his shoulder lightly. "And we're all going to listen." My brother frowned, my father stiffened in his chair, and my mother looked anxious. But the boy, perhaps emboldened by my support, or simply tired of pretending, spoke with a surprisingly firm voice. "I don't want to follow the military path. I want to be an astronomer." A heavy silence fell over the room. I saw my brother start to open his mouth, probably to scold his son, but I interjected. "That's an incredible dream, and it deserves our support," I said firmly. "Eli has a natural talent for math and science. It would be a waste not to nurture that." My father, surprisingly, was the first to speak afterwards. "The boy has the right to choose his own path." We all stared at him, shocked. He shrugged, with an almost imperceptible half-smile. "The world changes. We have to change too." In that moment, I felt the cycle break. The expulsion I suffered would not be my nephew's fate. The pain I carried had, in the end, served a higher purpose, opening a crack in the rigid walls of family tradition. Later, as I was leaving, my father called me aside. "You did the right thing today," he said, with an uncommon sincerity. "I don't want Eli to go through what you did." "Neither do I, Dad," I replied. "No one should have to choose between being who they are and having a family." He lowered his eyes, the closest he would ever come to showing remorse. "Sometimes, you have to lose something to understand its true value. And sometimes," I added, You have to be lost to find your real path. That night, as I returned to my apartment and gazed out at the city lights through my window, I pondered the irony of life. I was kicked out for rejecting a military career, and years later, I used the strategies I'd learned from observing my father, discipline, planning, leadership, to run my own empire. The difference is that I never imposed those values on anyone. In my company, we value diversity of thought, creativity, and the freedom to disagree and propose new ideas. We created a culture I wish I had found in my own family. A few days later, I received a call from my nephew. "Thanks, Uncle," he said, his voice choked up. "Dad said he'll support me. He told me he talked with you and realized he needs to do things differently." I smiled, feeling an emotion I could hardly name. "I'm happy for you, Eli. And if you ever need help getting into a good university for astronomy in the future, you can count on me. You're my hero," he replied, with the sincerity only a child can have. After hanging up, I reflected on how sometimes stories take generations to be rewritten. My expulsion, a rejection born of rigidity, and the inability to accept difference, had years later become the seed for a profound change in our family dynamics. Now, when I look back, I no longer feel the acute pain of abandonment. In its place is a mature understanding that every part of our past brought us here, a place where the expelled boy became a man capable of reaching out to help the family that once rejected him, not out of obligation or vengeance, but by his own choice. And perhaps that is what it truly means to grow up, to understand that even the deepest wounds can transform into sources of strength, that abandonment can lead to self-discovery, and that sometimes you have to lose a family to build, through your own hands, sweat, and tears, something far greater than what was left behind.